Haddon. I'm a barrister at St Ives Chambers and I specialise in private law, and part of that involves parental alienation. Today we're going to discuss parental alienation, what it is, how it affects children. The very illustrious panel involves Dr. Adrienne Barnett, who is a senior lecturer in law at Brunel University, London, and has great experience with regard to researching parental alienation. Dr. Joanna Silberg is president of the Leadership Council on Child Abuse and Interpersonal Violence, and she joins us from America, as does Dr. Bob Geffner, who's the distinguished research professor at psychology at Allant International University, San Diego. He's been there for over 20 years. He's also the founding president of the Institute of Violence, Abuse, Trauma in San Diego. On top of that, we also have an excellent barrister at St Ives Chambers, Tom Harrell, who also specialises in children's law and is very familiar with parental alienation cases. So I'm going to start with a very easy question, he says. What is parental alienation? Who wants to take that first? Bob, you're looking.
I will.
Okay.
I'll take it. And what I'll say is that, unfortunately, it's a great question because we don't have a universal definition. And the point that I'm going to be making over and over again is that we need to parse the terms into all of its component parts, like, do parents disparage children? What is the effect when parents going through divorce disparage children? Which children are most affected by that? How are they affected? What are the best treatments if children are affected? And what I believe has happened, and I don't believe it's anybody's fault, is that as people began to start observing the phenomenon, they lumped lots of things together. And that's the progress of science and the progress of human thinking in general. You know, you accommodate and then you assimilate. You accommodate and you assimilate. You make categories, you expand categories. Well, right now we're at a critical place with the concept of parental alienation where it's absolutely essential that we start to parse it, because what we have in it is so many mixed definitions that we can't get good reliability. So I think first step is, let's go back to describing behaviors and looking at the actual data we have on what happens to children during divorce. I'm suggesting we take a step back. Other people may have another view, but that's what I want to suggest.
His Honour Judge Bellamy, who you may be familiar with, in a couple of cases, in a case called Ray S and in a case called Ray D, referred to Dr. Weir, who you may be familiar with, who gave this description of the concept of alienation. There are children who show an extraordinary degree of animosity towards a parent with whom they once had a loving relationship. Most of these children will show some or all of a cluster of psychological responses with an individual child and between children in the same family. The presence of the features can very rapidly over time and place, but in their full manifestation are so surprising and unique to be unforgettable. The proposed term alienation only applies to the cluster of psychological responses in the child, with no need to presume a deliberate campaign of denigration by one parent. Does that come close, or is that?
Well, you have pieces of that. I think the key, as Joy was saying, is this is a common term. I mean, if you ask anybody in the street, oh yeah, parental alienation. It sounds obvious, something going on with one parent trying to turn a child or children against the other parent. And that's been the common definition, if you want, for decades. Unfortunately, the definition and the term have been corrupted, and that's been the problem. We all know cases. We deal with family law cases in the United States, do those types of evaluations, as does Dr. Silberg. And we all come up into cases where a parent tries or sometimes attempts to turn a child against another parent in a very highly disputed divorce case with a lot of animosity. that's a different situation than what we face nowadays in many of the family court cases. The term is really deals with behaviors, and you said it as part of your definition. Alienating behaviors. It's not a verb, it's not a label, it's a description of various behaviors that a parent may or may not do or carry out. That's what we need to focus on. The part of the definition that you just read that is problematic is suggesting there is research or some other type of common symptoms of a child, or that this happens frequently. What does happen frequently is parents who are in a very contentious divorce case and are not too happy with their spouse, ex-spouse, etc., obviously will not be happy about that person. And it would not be unusual for them to say bad things. Oh, he's at it again, or oh, there she goes. And that the kids may overhear that. That's a different situation than an intentional attempt to turn a child against another parent. You also said a previous loving relationship and a surprising set of symptoms or behaviors. I don't know exactly what you said, but it was something along those lines in your definition. That's not exactly correct, and research doesn't necessarily support those things. That has been the problem, is the common term for certain behaviors has been turned into a label, parental alienation. In fact, it's used too often as a diagnosis or a condition. That's where you run into problems. That's what those people who have proposed parental alienation as a diagnosis, an official one, have been turned down, but they haven't stopped. They've tried in our language, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they flatly turned it down 7 years, 8 years ago. Then they've been trying recently to get it in the International Classification of Diseases. And they've been told several times by these various neutral committees that this is not a diagnosis, it is not a label, it is not a condition. It's a set of behaviors. And when it occurs, then you have to treat it as dysfunctional parenting behavior. There is no common set of symptoms that a child will show if this has occurred. Too often what happens is this becomes a circular argument. In other words, we assume that a child is giving you reasons for not wanting to see a parent, like I'm afraid of him, or he's done this, or she's done that. And they don't believe it for whatever reason. They assume it's a false allegation. Or, you know, my father or my mother never spends time with me, so I'm tired of going over there. I don't want to go there anymore. And they assume that somebody is programming this child to make these types of disclosures. Unfortunately, they don't have the evidence in these cases to show that in many of the cases that we deal with. When there are indeed those types of behaviors, then we would treat them like we would any other type of dysfunctional parenting, refer to a counseling or a parenting program, and we would treat the children if they've been traumatized. But that's a whole different set of situations than what we face nowadays in courts, and that is happening in family courts throughout the world.
Oh, can I just cut across you? One of the things which we see quite regularly in these types of cases when they go through the courts in England and Wales is that the parent who believes that a child has been alienated against them will show lots of loving photographs and cards saying, I love you, Daddy, or I love you, Mummy. Here's lovely times at us at the zoo or somewhere. Dr. Barnett, what do you say about those types of evidence, perhaps?
Yes, and I recall that happening when I was in practice at the bar. And of course, you know, parents, children can often have very lovely and loving times with parents, going back historically. And one would always hope that would be the case. But as many judges said, when I was involved in cases like that, a snapshot photograph doesn't really say very much. It can say a great deal, but it may not say very much. you know, children who've been in very abusive relationships with parents. In those situations, parents can still produce happy snapshots. Now, of course, it may be the case that, of course, that parent and child were in a loving relationship. But then again, it may not. So as many judges have said to me, you can't really, you know, run a case on photographs. Can I just say something about the knotty issue of what is parental alienation? I've reviewed a lot of the studies that have been done in of parental alienation in various family courts internationally. Not that there are that many of them, but such that there are, and some of the literature. And it seems that there are probably as many definitions as there are experts on parental alienation. If you look at the case law, judges take such different approaches to parental alienation in different courts in England and Wales and in different courts in other jurisdictions. I think a barrister in another set of chambers wrote an article where he had done a review and found loads of different definitions used in courts, citing just 6 of them in the article. They also found a different range of approaches. I think Suzanne Zakur's study in Quebec was very interesting and has some resonance here in England and Wales, where some courts adopted a child-focused approach, looking at signs, symptoms, behaviors in the child. Others looked at parents' behaviors, and it was that latter which seemed to predominate. And using parent behaviors seemed to conflate and widen the category of parental alienation so that just about any behaviors by a parent could be subsumed within the category of parental alienation. A parent coming into court saying, I have concerns about contact because, could immediately be labeled parental alienating. And that seems to be the kind of problem with conflating this concept, because there is no agreed or consistent definition.
Is one of the problems, and I imagine, Tom, you've experienced this as well. It is one of the problems is because we're adopting, and you can blame me because I called this webinar on the title of parental alienation, we're more interested in bandying around the term parental alienation, rather than, which does come in more and more cases in England in the last few years, rather than actually saying, well, what's the issue? And how do we determine what that is? Tom?
No, I agree with that. And it really picks up on the point that Bob started with, is that the man on the street knows what's meant by parental alienation, but it's used in a loose way that, as Adrienne said, you can bend if you're skillful enough to fit the set of circumstances. So it's something that at the same time is not only difficult to establish, but difficult to disprove once that hair has been set running. And it can almost become a self-fulfilling prophecy in some cases. One example, given we were talking about snapshot photos a moment ago, there's a study by Warshak in 2015 where he particularly talks about a photograph and the careful lines that therapists have to tread between accepting what the child says. So in this study, there's the example that he gives is the child is smiling in a photo. It looks, to all intents and circumstances, completely honest, but the child maintains that he was smiling because he was being pinched by the father, although the hands aren't there. And the way it was approached in court was effectively, the lawyer said, well, you can't discount the child was pinched a millisecond before the photograph was taken. And for a therapist dealing with this, and I'd certainly be interested to hear how our panel approach this issue, is how do you tread that line between working with a child who believes what they're saying is true or has been led to say it's true, so that you can work with them, versus approaching it with an appropriate degree of skepticism or an outright refusal based on court's findings without alienating that child. because whatever the situation is, of course, the situation one would hope to get to if the alienation has been caused is to recover that child from that position and work further forward. I'm sorry if that's a little long-winded, but I just wanted to set out in response to where we got to the issue looking on a welfare basis.
I was going to say something, but I think, Joy, you wanted to say something.
Well, I did. I wanted to respond both to what we just heard from Mr. Harrell, as well as the idea of surprising. So in your original definition, Jason, you were mentioning that there's something odd, surprising, unexpected, or you might see the word insufficient or unrealistic or unreasonable. Now, what I want to say, and what I have told my students, I've been teaching 40 years clinical child psychology. If you're surprised, you haven't finished your job, because your job as a clinical psychologist doing an evaluation is to find out why. So if you're left saying this just doesn't make sense, well, you're the evaluator. Find out. Don't be surprised. So in a way, I feel that it's us being lazy as a field if we're willing to say, well, it's unreasonable, it's insufficient, it's just surprising. A person wouldn't react that way. Well, the fact is the child did react that way. Let's find out together why. And what I find when I do a careful evaluation, I'm not left surprised. I'm left with all of my hypotheses evaluated, and I'm left with the one that fits all the data and doesn't leave me surprised. And I don't like these value judgments like insufficient to be angry. You tell me my husband didn't pick up the milk that I asked him, and that's insufficient for me to be angry. Well, you can't tell me if it's insufficient. If I'm going to be angry, I'm going to be angry. You can't tell a child it's insufficient just because he didn't take you to your sport event for you to be angry. Well, that might have been the most important thing for that child that day or that year. So I don't like these value judgments. I don't like this surprising reaction, insufficient reason, unreasonable. Let's understand, where's the child coming from? Why do they feel that way? If the child is saying they were pinched, let's hear, what is that all about? What do you mean you were pinched? Did your dad tell you you had to smile? Do you often get pinched? Was that every picture or just this picture? That's what I'm skilled as a clinical child psychologist to do. And I encourage any evaluator, don't stop with being surprised. Get there.
Joanna, many people agree with you from the people listening, but there is an issue with that, because social workers who are either employed by local authorities or employed by CAFCAS very often don't have the research, the time, the resource to undertake that type of work which you're recommending, and that they will simply add 2 and 2 and get parental alienation, because often they will ask the child, why, who do you want to spend time with? And if they are surprised because the child doesn't say, I want to spend time with mummy, I want to spend time with daddy, they then might jump, and I've certainly seen it in cases, I'm sure Tom has, that they might jump to the conclusion, well, there must be something surprising elsewhere, i.e. a form of alienation, a form of pressure, causing the child's reaction in that fashion.
Well, you actually just said a key issue there. They assume.
We don't have the resources terribly in a lot of these cases.
Well, it depends on what you mean by resources. I'm going to assume that people can ask questions. And if you listen to what everybody's been saying so far, a couple of assumptions. We generally assume that kids love both parents. And going back to what Adrienne said, even in abusive situations, they tend to love both parents. They don't like the behaviors, but that's separate from loving a parent. And usually we can tell untrained people because they assumed because a child runs and jumps on a parent's lap and gives them a hug that they weren't abused. Well, we know from decades of research that's not accurate. But going back to the other situation you just mentioned, because again, photographs are not a big deal to us. We can assume they had a loving relation at one time or another. That's not the key now. But the key, back to what Joy said, is, why are they saying this? And the question and the comment you just made, Jason, about they don't have the resources, I don't agree. I think the problem is too many of them make assumptions. They assume that when a child says, I don't want to see dad, I don't want to go over there anymore, or mom, either one, and they don't understand the reason because, as Joy said, they're using adult logic in their view, doesn't mean it's the same as the children's. The children could have a variety of reasons, but we don't ask them enough. We assume that their information is not correct. So it doesn't take a lot of resources to spend time with those children, to be asking them questions about, well, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? What was the last time what happened the last time you were over there? We find that many of the people, social workers in our child protective services systems or others similar to around the world, don't have a lot of time. They have a large caseload, but that doesn't stop them from asking these questions and believing that, well, maybe there is something going on here. Maybe there is some type of inappropriate parenting or neglect or lack of paying attention to them or something that has caused this reaction, as opposed to assuming somebody got them to say this. Two things to just add. We do have research, and we've had it for a long time by a variety of researchers around the world, actually, that the idea of programming a child, which is essentially what you're talking about, somehow one parent is getting the child to make up these situations about either abusive behavior or inappropriate parenting, and turning them against the other parent. And so the child relays whatever they've been told. Well, we now know that, we don't know the mechanism that occurs. But what we do know from research is it's very hard to, quote, program a child to say something really detailed and or negative about another parent they really have a loving relationship with. In fact, some studies now show that when you try to do that, you actually get a reverse effect. So I begin to resent the person who's trying to get me to turn against the parent that I do have a relationship with, as opposed to programming. In fact, Gail Goodman in California has done some excellent research showing how difficult it is, especially even with young kids, anywhere from 3 to 6, to get them to say things that they know are not true. And she's had a whole variety of studies over a good 2 to 3 decades with a variety of researchers that show we don't know a mechanism that this occurs to program a child to make a disclosure. I think the key in the cases that both of you, Tom and Jason, have referred to is going back to what Joy said, asking questions, just looking at no assumptions. I'm not going to believe a child is making it up. I'm not going to believe a parent is or isn't doing anything. I'm just going to keep asking, tell me more about that. You'd be surprised how many evaluations we review around the United States and other countries where they really don't spend much time asking the kids the questions about what goes on in mom's house, what goes on in dad's house. What do you like about what's going on in mom's house? What do you like about what's going on in dad's house? What don't you like? What gets you upset? This doesn't take a lot of resources. What it does take is the ability to be neutral, to not make assumptions, and to ask key questions and spend a little bit of time with the child or children who are telling you these things.
Can I ask two questions actually arising from there? One of the matters, Adrienne, which you raise in some of your research papers is reference to the Women's AIDS paper, 19 child homicides. And obviously we know that things have got much worse over COVID with respect to domestic abuse. Mm. But can you just explain the impact of any form of domestic abuse on a child with respect to how they bond with one or both parents?
Yes, I mean, there's a huge amount of literature from numerous jurisdictions about the effects of domestic abuse on children. Now, obviously, I think Joy and Bob are the experts when it comes to effects on children. But having reviewed a tremendous amount of the literature for the Ministry of Justice inquiry, what is clear, first of all, is that children living with domestic abuse, and I think this is now recognized, aren't bystanders, they're not witnesses. They are victims in their own right. They experience it, and in a very active way. If you look at research, for example, by Jane Callahan and others, a huge EU-wide study where lots of children were interviewed, they are incredibly aware of what's going on in their homes, even very young children. And they feel it themselves, the sort of experiences of coercive control, for example, the entrapment. Children feel it just as much as the entrapped parent. And the effects on children, children can, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong by the other experts here, children can recover from experiences of domestic abuse. And of course, the effects are, physical, psychological, developmental, emotional harm. They can recover, particularly if they have the support of the non-abusive parent. But all the research shows that continuing contact with the abusive parent, particularly if the abuse is continuing, seriously impedes that recovery. And this is something which just can't be underestimated. The victim may escape from the abusive relationship, the victim and children, but if that abuse is continuing, it's difficult for the victim to heal, it's difficult for the children to heal, and difficult for the victim to support the child.
As Jan James says, it's right, though, if you are a parent who is actively attempting to alienate a child, and I know there's a difference between intentional and unintentional, but if you are a parent, and again, I've seen this in cases and judges have made findings about some, I'm sure the same's for Tom, then that is also domestic abuse, isn't it?
I think one always has to go back to the research. Peer-reviewed empirical research and research by of generalizable quantitative and qualitative case file analysis, that is, case files of family court cases in England or Wales. There was a large study done by Liz Trinder and others in 2013, another study in 2015, a study by Kafkas and Women's Aid in 2017, and they all consistently found that cases of what were then called implacable hostility, unjustified denials of contact, turning children against the other parent, were very, very small, about 4 to 5% of total cases. I think the difficulty that we're having here is that many cases are being misread. And what the researchers found was that many cases were misread as alienation and implacable hostility. So the idea that it's widespread and prevalent was being conflated into situations which were simply not alienation or hostility. But there is a situation where I think that is absolutely correct, where I wouldn't use the term parental alienation because I think it does get so misused, where a perpetrator of domestic abuse, particularly somebody who perpetrates coercive and controlling abuse, one of the key tactics that has been found by numerous studies is denigrating the relationship between the parent and child, trying to disrupt that relationship. But you can see the difference between that in the context of domestic abuse and somebody who makes an allegation that their child has been alienated from them without a context of wider domestic abuse. And I think that is key to considering that different situation. I'm contacted frequently by a lot of parents, mostly mothers, who say, I have been alienated from my child. And then they give a whole description of a highly abusive relationship with this, to use the term colloquially, alienation as part of that abuse. That's very different from a parent who says, my child's been alienated from me for no good reason, but there is no context of domestic abuse there. And very often the person saying they've been alienated is the abusive parent.
Joanna, you're nodding enthusiastically.
Well, I just so much agree with what is being said there. So in my own research, we looked at what we call turned around cases. So there are cases in which before the age of 18, a child was sent to live with someone who was later designated as an abuser to that child. The average amount of time that children spent was approximately 4 years with a parent who was labeled later by a different court or the same court as being the abusive parent.
So let me just cut across you so we understand this. This is a judge who has changed residence, as we say, from one parent to another, and you're explaining the effects on that.
No, it's actually more than that.
Okay.
It's actually twice. It's time 1 and time 2. At time 1, there are allegations of abuse. The judge ignores it and sends the child to live with the abuser. At time 2, before the child is 18, another judge or the same judge turns around the finding, or it's done by appeal, or it's done in some other way. Sometimes the child themselves put in a petition. Before the child is 18, there's time 2, and the child is then put back with the safe parent. And we looked at what happens, what's going on with time 1. And what I want to echo is what we just heard from Adrienne, which is often it is the domestic abuse, which is continuing to occur in the abusive household, which people could call alienation, but I will not use that word. I call it domestic abuse by proxy, because what they're really doing is continuing to harm the ex-wife through harming the children. And those are our cases which are turning around. Those are the ones which are turning around, where the judge has misidentified who's the abuser, put the child with someone later termed to be the abuser, and the way that it's uncovered is through this continuing abuse to the child, often accelerating physical abuse, accelerating emotional abuse. Let me give you an example of a tactic from someone employing what I call domestic violence by proxy. This is a case in my sample. So the child comes home from visiting the mother, and the father takes a knife and stabs the stuffed animal that the mother has given the child till all the stuffing comes out. Now, probably not against the law to murder a stuffed animal, but clearly abusive to the child. Later, we find that this father has put a hot poker from the fireplace on the child's chest and caused burns as the way to get the child to bed. So the type, I think this is a good illustration of what we just heard from Adrienne. The type of abusive personality that's going to actually put a child to bed by burning their body with a poker is the kind of personality that will do this malignant form of abuse by proxy, which people want to call alienation, but is so different than just oh, I'm being alienated and there's no real concrete behavioral signs. I think the behavioral sign of the stabbed stuffed animal was a precursor to the kind of violence we were going to see from this man. So I don't want to go on and on, but I wanted to illustrate what Dr. Barnett was saying with my own research, which really did discover that.
I'm going to ask Tom to help me with this. One of the things I see often, again from social workers, is that where there is a scenario where a child doesn't want to see the absent parent or the non-resident parent, the resident parent might say, oh, there was abuse 5 or 6 years ago, or abuse even longer than 5 or 6 years ago. And the social workers, CAFCAS, will say, oh, well, that all took, and also courts will say, that took place a long time ago. It's historical. It no longer matters. Tom, have you seen that type of thing?
That was almost exactly what happened in a case of mine in Leicester. Those were proceedings that ran for 8 years. There was complicated background in that both parents had mental health issues, and the biological mother had attempted suicide in front of the child. Because of the time between the matter coming to trial and the index event, the difficulty in that was separating out alienation, which is something that my client was alleged to have done in respect of the child and the biological mother, and justifiable estrangement on the basis that contact hadn't taken place for so long and the child felt that their mother wasn't that interested in them. And that's a difficult value judgment for any social worker to make, and one that the psychologist in that case actually recognised and factored into her analysis quite neatly.
Yeah, that's rare, isn't it, often, but they do factor that in. I think you were very lucky in that case to have such a good social worker.
No, but the experts in that case, unfortunately for my client, were very good.
If I can comment on a few different things that people were saying, because I agree with everything, but in their pieces especially. The issue and the example that we're given just now too is going back to what Adrienne said, and we're all saying in one respect or another, is looking at the situation of the use of power and control in the family. When we're talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, if we're talking about child abuse, neglect, physical, sexual, psychological, the key in these cases is the inappropriate use of power and control, where one person, and in this case a parent, is getting their own needs met at the expense of another. Could be the spouse or it could be the children. But the power and control is the key. And these are the issues we do not see people asking about or trying to look at in more detail. We have very specific definitions of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And we have a lot of research over 40 years. Same as Adrienne was saying, we have lots of research that we and others have done and have published on the effects of being in a home where there is domestic violence. We also have significant research on child abuse and neglect, what the definitions are and the symptoms and what it causes. So we have that. What's been happening lately, which is a little bit like what you were talking about, is all of a sudden this term parental alienation is trying to be, by those who promote it, woven into domestic violence. It's a form of domestic violence, or it's a form of child abuse. Well, certain behaviors may be or may not be, but that's just a catchword phrase. What we're finding is in dealing with child custody evaluators, mental health professionals, judges, attorneys, social workers, child protective services, we've done about, now it's going on 7 or 8 years of research that we're now finalizing and publishing, looking at what knowledge do these people who deal with children on a regular basis actually have about the research, especially in child custody cases. And what we find is that they assume that there is parental alienation, and that when you have allegations of either domestic violence or child abuse, they're false if it's a child custody case. And that's from law enforcement to social workers to judges to attorneys. And it's not a small percentage, it's a huge percentage. And they don't understand the research that shows that this is not a common occurrence. Unintentional saying something negative about another parent in a disputed custody case is not unusual. An intentional act of over and over repeating how bad the other parent is and trying to get the child doesn't occur as frequently as people keep assuming, and nowhere near as much as child abuse or domestic violence occurs. And so we're back to that situation where it's the bias that's the problem. We have cases, and just like Joy does, and I'm sure you have too, where the child says something They not only do not want to see a parent, but they actually, if you listen, will tell you why. I'm afraid of them, or they touch me, or they don't pay attention to me, or, you know, I have to do everything that person wants. I'm not allowed to ever talk in their home. I have to do everything on a very specific schedule. And, you know, whatever it is, they're giving you reasons, but we don't believe them. I don't want to say we need to believe everything a child says. We go back to finding out more, as Joy had said, but we go the opposite way in these cases and assume that this behavior has occurred and it's a condition, that it's an alienated child or a targeted parent, or this person has been suffering from parental alienation, or all sorts of different things like that. And that's where things get off base. And then the solutions to this are absurd. And it doesn't meet anything we know in trauma psychology, family psychology, child development, or any of these areas, because the solution, once you decide parental alienation has occurred, is not what we would do with any inappropriate parenting behaviors, which is teach them appropriate parenting, provide counseling, provide some type of therapy so that they can understand what's happening to the child or what they're doing is hurting their child. No, that's not what we try to do. We immediately take this child, in the examples you've already heard here, away from their primary caretaker and place them with the person they say they don't want to see. And they do it suddenly and send them to these types of programs or camps to essentially deprogram them. And this is so dangerous. It's like the going to the last resort first and producing so much trauma and other things. That's incredible. I just want to make one more comment because I saw it in one of your chats. Somebody was commenting about Amy Baker's research. There have been significant publications by us and others of how poorly done that is and was. There are no common symptoms that she's found. She had a very biased small sample and has actually written more about that than the number of subjects she had. And her research was just flawed incredibly. And so people assume there's these cluster of this or there's that. We've had 30 years since this approach has been promoted in family courts. And Richard Gardner started all this. And there's been really no systematic research in any country, anywhere in the world, that has really documented a condition or an obvious set of symptoms or an obvious profile, or even showed what the prevalence of this actually is. It's all based on assumptions and a few poor studies. And that's been a real problem. And that's why all these official organizations have not accepted this as a diagnosis or a condition. That doesn't mean it's not used, but that's a serious issue. So I probably talked too much.
Well, I understand your opinion on that. Obviously, Miss Baker's not here to defend or support her research, but I note your comments with regard to that, your personal comments on that regard. I was going to ask this, and it might be something that Joanna wants to answer. Is it right that a child can live in a household where mum and dad, or mum and mum, or dad and dad have split up, and he realizes, or she realizes, that they are now in a smaller house than the family, the matrimonial home, that there isn't as much money as there once was in the home, and they're living with one parent, the resident parent, and that they blame unilaterally, there might be the odd unintentional word said here or said there, but they blame the other parent. They become protective of the resident parent, and as a consequence of that, in their own minds, they take a dislike or even an anger to the non-resident parent.
That is incredibly common. That's bread and butter. It happens in almost every case I see after divorce, that there's some alliance with one parent versus the other. And as a child psychologist, I treat it all the time. And I treat it very successfully with reasonable parents who'd have some anger and helping them understand the impact it's having on their children, and allowing the child at first to have, let's say, just a breakfast where where daddy and child agree they're only going to talk about certain things and not other things, and the child beginning to improve the relationship and diminishing the blame. And I think that you've put your finger on something, that this common bread and butter, everyday occurrence, Judith Wallerstein found that when she did her research on children, is a common thing. But then to elevate it into criminal behavior to the point where moms or dads are losing their children over it, this is adding a dimension of trauma that is unnecessary. Yes, there is alliance with one versus the other, and yes, reasonable people seeing a psychologist or another health professional can work this through for the benefit of their children, and the majority of families do that. It's only the very small minority of families that end up in family court where they have this escalating inability to negotiate. And what the studies show over and over again is those are the families in which there is some component of coercive control, domestic violence, emotional abuse between the parents. Those are the ones where the resolution cannot happen with using mental health professionals or mediators or other kinds of, very sophisticated tools that we have out there. But let's not then generalize from this minority to say this is what's happening with all these other families. I can't tell you how many families I've talked to who recognize there's something wrong with the way the child is reacting, and what's my responsibility, and how can I protect myself from saying the wrong things. Parents are open to doing this. There's only a minority in which this doesn't happen easily, and those are the ones in which there is some type of severe pathology in one of the parents, which makes them so concerned about their own selves that there is pathology that then gets transmitted. But that is not common, and we have to look for every other reason before we go down that route. And it's so easy to go down that route. I like to say it costs a penny to give a diagnosis of parental alienation, and it costs $1 million metaphorically to actually parse it out to see what's going wrong. So let's not jump for the easy solution. Let's really figure it out.
Joy, I don't want to lose you work here. You say you've dealt with lots of families and lots of children in those circumstances where they have felt an angst to another parent for whatever reason. How do you treat those children? How do you bring those children to a situation where they might want to spend time with the other parent?
So I'm going to give you a specific example. This is a girl who is biracial. She has an African-American parent and a white parent. And when she was, after they went through a divorce, she was identifying more with the white parent and not so much with the African-American parent. And every time she went to see the African-American parent, he was saying things like, we should really take a trip to Africa, and you should really add Black studies into your curriculum. And you know what? It was getting her angry, more and more and more and more angry. This was like a normal type of a thing. He's afraid that she's losing one aspect of his culture, and he has every right to be worried about that. And yet she's sort of identifying with the parents she's living with. So I wanted to improve their relationship. So we made some rules together. I had them both come in my office. I said, she's having discomfort when she's having meals with you because the things that you bring up are just sort of triggering her into getting angrier and angrier and angrier. What are some safe topics to talk about? She explained to him why she didn't want to just keep hearing about trips to Africa all the time. But not that she was rejecting her heritage. She wasn't. But it had become this big issue. We made a list. What could we talk about? We had planned dinners. They came back in. I asked them, how did it go? Did daddy follow the rules he promised? Did she follow the rules that he promised? Because also things she said triggered him, like defending mommy or whatever, she was doing. They discussed what triggered them. I have a lot of success with everyday kinds of experiences like this, working with a child who doesn't want to see the parent whatsoever, to the point where they're happily going for weekends. And it doesn't take extreme measures. It doesn't take a camp where they're forced. It doesn't take coercion. It just takes listening to each person's point of view, working it out, having the mother or the father describe what makes it unpleasant for them with the child, and listening to both points of view. It works like a charm in almost all cases. So I wanted to explain that because it gets lost. People think that there's no solution. Well, for this type of thing, it's not that hard to work out solutions. Did that explain it well enough?
Yeah, but Tom, you'll have seen this. Often in a number of the cases which we see, the judge is advised by psychologists that there needs to be a transfer of residence, and the former resident parent shouldn't see the child for 3 months or so.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing before you talk, Mr. Harrell. One thing. The cases where it doesn't work is where there's abuse and violence. Then I can't use my approach. Now I'll stop. Go ahead.
Tom.
Yeah, well, there's a certain line of thinking that because that alienating parent is abusive, in order to recover from that, I can see Bob nodding in the same way as the camps he described, there has to be a period of time for reprogramming. And it's difficult as to how that's managed. The other way that it's done is there's not a direct move. So in the case I was talking about earlier, the proposal was a bridging placement in foster care prior to any move, which again brings a whole number of other issues up with it.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying before about it's like the last resort being done first. And that's what was promoted when this started happening in the late 90s, is that it was supposed to be for the most extreme cases where you've tried everything else, then you do this. But in the cases we see, just like Joy, it's the first solution. It's parental alienation, remove the child, don't let the other parent, even though they've been the primary attachment and caretaker, see the child, talk to the child, have any contact for X amount of time. A case we're working on right now, that X amount of time started as 1 month, then it went to 3 months, then it went to 9 months. It's now been 1.5 years because the child is not refusing to back off their initial allegations. There are some key terms that get confused, and I wanted to go back to that for a second because it helps explain some of this. And Joy mentioned it, but did it quickly. There is a difference between a parent attempting to intentionally to turn their child against the other parent from a child who rejects a parent for one reason or another, or a child who is estranged from a parent, or who aligns, as Joy was saying, with a parent. The key issues there is first, the relationship. Second, the dynamics of the relationship that led to these different situations. And what is the attachment relationship? And this goes back to your original question, Jason, about the pictures and a child who supposedly had a very loving relationship. And then all of a sudden, I think was your term, but I may have been paraphrasing, turns against that parent. Well, that's not a usual situation. And in fact, if you just ask these kids and you listen to what they're saying, they did not have a strong attachment to that parent. They did not have a strong relationship, which is different from loving the parent. We will assume that the kids love both parents. In an ideal world, they want them both to get along. They want to be able to have contact with both, and they want both to be a good parent. All right, but that's not the situation we're talking about. And looking at that attachment, and I don't mean just throwing out the words, the child has a good attachment to the parent, but that really has a specific meaning. And that's really the key in the cases we deal with too, is when you go back and look, and it goes back to some of that power and control issues, they did not have a strong attachment to that other parent. They do not have that bond, and there is reasons they are rejecting. Now, I've seen a variety of things come through the chat too about prevalence, and your country, our country can tell you from years of research what is the prevalence of domestic violence in families. We can tell you what the prevalence is of child abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, or, you know, in years of research, your country, our country. We can cite you the statistics. Now, when we talk about parental alienation, we get anecdotal. And I even saw it in some of your chats. You know, we have 1,500 alienated parents. Well, your research shows you have thousands and thousands of cases of domestic violence. And we know what the effects of those are on children. And we still have to treat that. And we treat the perpetrator and we treat the victim. Labels don't get us anywhere. You focus on the behaviors, which is exactly what Joy was saying in her treatment, which is the same thing we would do. No matter what the behavior is, you treat it. The idea of making assumptions and that bias is really dangerous. And as soon as I see somebody saying, well, this is a parental alienation syndrome case or parental alienation disorder or parental alienation, then what I'm going to look for is what are the alienating behaviors? What is the evidence? What has somebody observed of this parent doing these things to the child? What does the child say about what goes on in their home, turning them against the other parent? And we don't find those things very often. We do find them at times, but not very often. And that's the problem. And so when you said something earlier in this session about assuming or parents actually, you know, turning their kids against the other parents, it really becomes an issue of what did we mean? I've had cases where there is no observable evidence and the evaluator or social worker even says, well, there's no evidence that I can find of alienating behaviors, but, and that but is a key, but we know it's happened because the child is not believable or the child's reasons are not accurate. It's a false allegation. So therefore it must exist. This parental alienation must exist. And when we ask why, well, somehow the mother, in many cases it's the mother, but it could be either parent, has transferred this to the child through, I guess, osmosis or something. There's no attempt that they found. They will even say there's no obvious attempt of turning the child against it. But because the parent doesn't like the other parent, this child has picked that up.
Well, what you sometimes say, sorry to cut, what you sometimes say, and again, I refer to this in social worker reports, in CAFCAS reports. You see that the social worker, who very often has only met the child once, perhaps twice, will say that the child is using adult language. So the presumption is that the resident parent has either said something intentionally or said something out loud. B, you have scenarios where the child says, well, I know that the grandparents don't like the non-resident parent, or I know mum doesn't like the non-resident parent because she's called him A, B, or C. And sometimes you have, which is a slightly different point, you've had a child who will say, I hate everything about the non-resident parent. Not just, oh, he did this and I didn't like it, or she did this and I didn't like it. I've never had good times. I've never liked that person. I hate them, I hate them, I hate them. And those seem to be, from the social worker's perspective, and ultimately thereafter, sometimes from the court's perspective, your evidence. Now, I know that doesn't happen in every case, but you asked about evidence, and it seems to me that those are the three things. Tom might say there's something else, but those seem to be the three scenarios where there is evidence, so to speak.
Well, and it's interesting because we have those cases too. And what we do is, well, what was the first thing that started this? I mean, now they're saying they never want to see this parent again. They hate them. All the things you just said. But what did they say when this first started? Because what we find is there often was other things that were said, say back a year or two ago, or whenever it's, but they weren't believed, or nothing happened. And what happens and tends to happen with children and even adults is when somebody talks to you, if I'm talking to you and I know and I see, hey, you don't believe what I'm saying, you don't agree with that, then I'm either going to shut up, not talk to you again, or what I'm going to do is exaggerate to get your attention, to get you to start paying attention to what I'm saying. So by the time I get to you or a social worker, I don't want to ever see this person again. I hate him, I hate him, I hate him. Well, why? I just do. And yeah, that is not helpful. And now I just do, where's that coming from? And that goes back to what all of us have said at one time or another, is you still got to talk to the kids, but you got to go back and look at the records. What was the first time a disclosure was made? And was the first disclosure, I hate my parents, and it came out of the blue, which rarely happens? Or they talked about something that really made them uncomfortable, or that they were afraid, or that scared them, or all sorts of things. And you go back and talk more about that. We don't assume when a child says, I hate my parent, that that's going to get us anywhere. So then we actually look at what's going on in the family before and to now. And again, that doesn't take a huge amount of resources. What it takes is spending some time with the child. In a 1 hour interview with a child, it could take 1 hour just to build the rapport and trust, especially if so many other people have talked to them and they don't believe people are paying attention to them. So that's more the key, or a therapist. Before you send them to a camp or you automatically, withdraw them from a caretaker, let's find out what's going on and figure out what is the best way to solve this. Because ideally, we do want to build a relationship with both parents, and we may need to work with both parents. But that's a whole different approach than what we've been talking about. And that's what worries me, is too many of these court cases that Adrienne talked about, or Tom talked about, or you talked about, we jump to the conclusion way too quickly and make these assumptions, and then it just takes off from there.
Adrienne, please, I was going to say, does COVID have a factor on all of this?
Well, COVID certainly has a factor, is a huge factor in terms of escalating domestic abuse. Is it a factor in regard to parental alienation?
Yes.
Well, we don't know, do we? Because there's no research. I think we really need to keep going back to being research-led. What is the evidence? There's so much anecdotal stuff that gets floated around, bandied around, and we need the evidence. It's far too early. Evidence that research doesn't suddenly arise, in a matter of weeks. Yes, I agree. We need research on this. I'm very aware that accusations of parental alienation may well be escalating because of the current pandemic, because of the lockdown. I'm aware that some parents are saying they've been unjustifiably prevented from seeing children. Others are saying that parents are trying to stick to unsafe contact orders, but without proper systematic research into this. It's not, who knows what's going on out there. What I would say in relation to what Bob's been explaining, I think there's, and it goes back to, I think, what Tom was saying as well, is the strong assumption that's made, and there's a lot of research on this, in the courts, that, domestic abuse that hasn't taken place in the last few weeks or months is historic, it's irrelevant, let's move on, we need to be future focused. And very much of a misunderstanding, perhaps, of firstly how past abuse can continue to have a terrorizing effect on victims, but also it's taken very much an incident-led approach to domestic abuse, and failing to see how it is a pattern. It's for victims a way of living rather than specific incidents. And I'll give an example of one of the reported cases on parental alienation in England and Wales, where when the parents were much younger and the children were little, the father had, on his own terms, been a bit of a hellraiser and had been incredibly violent towards the mother, ended up putting her in hospital for months with severe life-threatening injuries from which she was still physically and emotionally affected. He then, 8 to 10 years later, he said, a reformed character, recognized what he did. Mother was still very scared of him. Children were resistant to seeing him. And the minute parental alienation was raised, this was all seen through that lens of there's no good reason why these children should be resistant to contact. They were much too young to be aware of it at the time. The mother's got to get over it. She's got to stop putting it in their face and so on. And to me, that misunderstands what's happening there on so many different levels. Firstly, this is, wasn't a one-off incident. Nobody suddenly puts their partner into life-threatening injuries in hospital as a one-off. It was clearly a pattern. How was that victim traumatized? Nobody inquired into this. The assumption that children wouldn't be aware because they were very little. So all of this led to the threat to this woman of having the children's residence removed to the father unless she agreed to contact. And I think that, perhaps not in such an extreme way, but that's what does somehow happen in so many cases. It's, let's put all of this behind us. You've got to get over it. So there must be no good reason why the children are resistant. How can we get contact going? We can't get it going. Change residence.
Tom, have you seen the phrase, and I know we should stay away from the phrase, but have you seen the phrase parental alienation almost as a silver bullet? I think that's Adrienne's phrase, with regard to a lot of these cases. It just turns out to kind of change the view of the guardians, perhaps.
Yeah, well, it gets thrown in. The comments in the chat just, I think, illustrate how many of our delegates experience the same thing. Once the cat's out of the bag in that sense, it gets seized on by a parent who likes that idea, and it's a way. And certainly listening to what Joy was saying earlier about thinking of it as a syndrome by proxy or domestic abuse by proxy is quite interesting. And I suppose it comes back to the headline for this talk is, at what point does denigration or negativity towards one parent become parental alienation? Because if it's only those cases where there's a significant pathological reason in one parent, then that's fine. But in the majority of cases, certainly that I see, we're dealing in that grey area between disputing breakdown that goes on and becomes a bit more than that, and something that's short of an identified pathology. So I agree with that in that sense.
I think also the problem is that the term parental alienation brings in such polarization, doesn't it? As soon as you've got the term in, you've got one parent saying, no, I haven't done anything, I've not been alienating, and the other one saying, there's no good reason, I'm perfect. And the fact is, in most cases, no parent is perfect. It's often, in very many cases, both parents may be, acting in different ways which aren't necessarily entirely in their children's interests, but it's to be expected because no one is perfect. But somehow this term seems to polarize people or drive them into these completely opposing camps where they both want to be seen as, spotless. And it's just not realistic, is it?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, what's interesting, and again, you were asking about resources. One of the things we do in every case is create a timeline. We go back to the beginning, what has happened over time, in the family, what has happened with allegations, what has happened with petitions to the court and court filings. That tells you a lot about where things are. One of the things that we find in many cases is that this whole idea of parental alienation, when it is actually occurs from an accusation standpoint. And what we find in most cases is that there was some allegation by the child to somebody about some type of uncomfortable or abusive behavior or exposed to domestic violence in the home first, or that the one parent talked about domestic violence, psychological, physical, etc., first. And then the accusation of parental alienation surfaced. We don't see too many cases where in the middle or all of a sudden we have allegations of parental alienation when none of these other things surfaced first. We see it in many of the cases we review or actually work on where that label is used after there have been some other types of allegations in a divorce case, or in fact, even before divorce was filed. In other words, there were allegations of either domestic violence or child abuse, even though a divorce wasn't necessarily filed for. And then all of a sudden we get the accusations of parental alienation. So that timing is real important when you're looking at trying to corroborate, because we see cases, and I saw it in the chat, where a court found that domestic violence was false. Well, I've seen a lot of cases, and it goes back to what Joy was saying, where people didn't really look at what the evidence was. And did other people see bruises? Were there reports of control and power issues being used beforehand? What else was going on in the home? And those types of things have been dismissed. We've had cases, the example that Joy gave, I've had several cases where you actually do have evidence of domestic violence, and perhaps a parent has been that way in a prior relationship, and it's ignored, and they say it's false allegations. And so, again, we go back to the research. We know what the prevalence is of domestic violence. We also know, surprising to many of your listeners, that there's no more incidences or allegations of domestic violence in a divorce case than in a non-divorce case. And we also know that when an actual investigation is done or research is done, the substantiation rates of domestic violence is really no different in divorce cases or custody cases than it is in non-divorce or custody cases. So we have that research, but that's not what people assume. When we did our research, people assume that if it's a child custody case, the allegations are false. And they assume that at rates of 75% or more, when the research shows it's not even close to that. So again, we go back to what started this whole discussion is getting away from labels, getting away from assumptions, focusing on what the evidence and behaviors are, and you act accordingly. If we have a case where a parent has indeed intentionally or unintentionally said things or tried to influence the child negatively, then we do need to treat that. That is not acceptable behavior. It's not good parenting. But to send them to a deprogramming camp, that also is not appropriate. In fact, it's dangerous and traumatizing. We need to look for how do you deal with those behaviors and how do you help the family become functional again. That's what we should be doing, not getting caught up in extremes, not getting caught up in labels, and then we have a chance of moving forward.
But what we do know with regard to domestic abuse is that it's very rare to actually have victims have evidence, because these things can be, and again, Adrienne, you've spoken about this already this evening, can be coercive, controlling abuse, which is listed within Practice Direction 12J for us here in England. But many tribunals struggle with the concept because very often it's he said, she said is the expectation at first instance from the court. Or it's not as easy to understand as, dare I say, a black eye or broken ribs.
Exactly. That's why it's called the family secret. But you know, there are witnesses to that. If you ask, guess who? It's back to the children. They're growing up in this home. If you ask them the right way, you know, not, you know, does mommy beat up daddy or does daddy beat up mommy? You talk about what they've experienced in the home. What are the things that scare them? What are the things that make them uncomfortable? You start finding out when you ask these neutral questions and you spend time with the children that they start reporting some of the corroboration. And that's what often led to the initial disclosures and not wanting to be around that parent. But you have to spend the time with the child to get to that and to ask them those questions.
There's a problem with that. And again, I think Tom will probably agree with this, Bob, which is scenario one. And it's been very interesting to hear from our experts in particular. But scenario one, the social workers and indeed the tribunals, which are often magistrates or judges, have not read the papers which have been referred to over the last hour. They're not familiar with the essays and the research. It's very rare that you have a social worker who has any understanding of parental alienation or the myriad of elements of the difficulties which a child might experience in coming to a view. The time they have to undertake their research, their time with the child is very rarely one visit at school for about 40 minutes. Certainly during COVID, most of those one-to-ones have not been at school. They've been in a parent's home via Zoom. That's right, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just thinking of the cases I've got, far more time is spent with the parents than with the children. And picking up on where Bob finished is it's asking those neutral questions to prompt primary information that allows you to find out what's going on rather than what one parent says and what the other one denies.
Yeah, and you just said something, oh, I'm sorry, Joy, but let me just say something because it is interesting and it goes back to mentality. Well, you know, we don't have resources. We don't have time. We can't spend 2 hours with the children. We don't have that amount of time. Well, how much is it costing you to deal with these cases for 5 years? How much is it costing society to deal with violence that is escalating? Where do you think these kids end up if we haven't treated them correctly? What do you think is going to end up happening down the road? I mean, we have a lot of documentation. So it goes back to the old expression, pay me now or pay me later. The amount of money we're paying out in court costs, in social programs, in educational, lack of educational achievement, no matter what we refer to, medical costs, we can trace back to adverse childhood experiences. And so if we don't deal with it then and spend the extra hour that you guys are talking about interviewing or getting somebody to talk to these kids, that extra hour or two, the cost of what that would be now versus what is going to be later on is no comparison. But we don't think that way. We don't think about long term. We think about short term. You know, I don't have the 2 hours now. But yeah, but it's going to take you 10 hours next year to deal with this. Or the courts. You were talking about how many of these cases go into court, which we deal with all the time too. So it makes sense to change the mentality, to figure out a way, as opposed to saying we can't do it, to do it, to spend a little bit more time with these kids now, even if it's less time with the parents, as Tom was saying, because the kids are the key. That's why we're all here, is what is in the best interest of the children. And so we need to focus on that. I can't tell you how many evaluations I review where they don't even assess the children to any length. Even the professionals, I'm not talking about social workers from agencies, I'm talking about somebody doing a custody evaluation, doesn't even spend 2 hours actually asking these questions of the kids or finding out what their level of trauma is or any of these things. And we have people in the United States who are going around training other professionals on not to interview kids because that's going to traumatize them, but sending them to this camp is okay. So it's a real dichotomy. and where we're going to provide and spend our resources, whether it's in the UK or the United States. And that's an area we've been working on for quite a while, is back to pay me now or pay me later.
Johanna, that's right. Training.
I wanted to comment on several things that might help us be more nuanced in our assessment of children. You mentioned the use of adult language. I want to debunk that. There are many, many children who love to use terms like anus, or I had a kid who said, it was right on my gluteus maximus. Do you know what that means? They like the interesting words. Let's not go be so simplistic that we're going to dismiss what a child says because of so-called adult language. You've got to be more nuanced than that. The other thing that I want to emphasize is something that makes children irate, reject, they're so principled that they can't tolerate it, is a parent lying. If they are in a meeting and they watch a parent lie about something that they know is true, and they've been told they always have to tell the truth, children often find that unforgivable. And when you hear this extreme rejection that children have, go to that. Say, do both of your parents tell the truth? They become irate about that. And here's what happens. It's ironic, and I think Bob touched on this earlier. The process of court makes their parents less and less the parents that they want their parents to be. The process of court makes the parents more extreme, more likely to lie in front of the child to professionals about what really did happen because they're being judged. The process of court makes these children more and more seemingly unreasonable in their rejection, but the reason is because their parents have become more and more unreasonable in their points of view, particularly the parent that has something to hide, who will say in front of the child, and no, that really never happened. If you're doing the kind of therapy that I'm suggesting, and I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, I'm just trying to help people talk about, don't talk about trips to Africa at the moment, it's upsetting her. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble, but if you're going to sit there and say, I've never once said that in a meeting ever, as if my judging them is the main thing, this is going to make the kid really, really angry. We're not going to have a lot of success. And then you may get this, what looks like unreasonable rejection. But if you were working with a close family person who you've observed doing something, and then they keep on denying it, you're going to get more and more and more and more so-called unreasonably angry too. So let's look at that. Let's look at whether the child is perceiving the parent becoming more extreme. And then one other thing I want to say that the kids find unforgivable. When they realize that one parent is trying to prevent them from access to the other and are filing things to keep them from a parent, that makes them actually extraordinarily angry. And it's one of those surprising, extreme things that children find unforgivable. So I want us to just respect the integrity of that child and really get into what are they really feeling. And I think you'll find it's reasonable from within their own perspectives.
Adrienne, I'm going to give you the final words. You've been working with the Ministry of Justice. The training of practitioners in this field, judges, magistrates, and social workers, resonated as an issue in 19 child homicides. It was part of the recommendations that you almost had to start from scratch and train. It's also appeared in some of the work that Dr. Emma Katz has undertaken, and we've had that discussion in a previous panel. What more needs to be done by way of final words here?
Two things, well, maybe three things. Firstly, let's look at what the research says that children say. And there's some excellent research out there where young people, for example, Jane Fortin's research, fantastic study done in 2012, who interviewed young people who had experienced their parents' separation or divorce when they were children. And what they have said, they're very enlightening. They had their own very good reasons for why relationships with both parents did or didn't work after their parents separated, and very understandable reasons. You know, for example, my mum or my dad, as the case may be, didn't spend much time for me. She was always on their phone when I was staying over, things like that. So let's listen to what young people are actually saying. Secondly, bearing in mind that so many of these cases do raise allegations of domestic abuse, let's just follow Practice Direction 12J. It's all in there. The biggest problem, and always has been since 2008 when it was first implemented, and going back 8 years to Re-L, is that it's not applied properly.
Or understood.
Not understood, but not applied. Sometimes that is for research reasons, but not always. Thirdly, the implementation plan by the government of the Ministry of Justice report should, I hope, if it all is implemented and bears fruition, make a tremendous difference. It's looking at piloting a system of getting right away from the adversarial system, having a more inquisitorial approach where the gathering of evidence will be more court-led, taking a more trauma-informed approach right through proceedings in the way that some of the US integrated domestic abuse courts do, being very much from a trauma-led approach. And also, as you've said, training. I'm aware that there is ongoing training by the Judicial College for the judiciary, but clearly it needs to be more substantial, more focused. And there are some good examples from the US. I think Professor Peter Jaffe has developed a really good training model. And so that should hopefully be happening. But it is extraordinary. And also, before I get on to the lawyers, social workers and CAFCAS, the proposal is that anyone who's doing reports for court should have accredited domestic abuse training,
yes,
which is a good thing. But it is extraordinary that those of us, and I say us because when I was still at the bar, who work so closely with victims of domestic abuse don't have any training. There's no compulsory training. You know, who has time to do all these CPD points other than perhaps online? And even that, I understand, has gone out the window now. So really, training for lawyers in domestic abuse is really important. You know, we work with people. We have an effect on people who could be going through PTSD, who could be very traumatized, and we need to know what we're doing.
Can I thank you all for your time?
No.
Joanna Silberg, Bob Geffner, and Dr. Adrienne Barnett, and indeed Tom Harrell. It's been a fascinating discussion this evening, or in the morning for some of you. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to close the seminar now. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much,
So much.
Jason. Thank you.
Thank you.